So some of this, again, has been that opportunity to sort of shine a light on some of what is happening in terms of that innovation on the grassroots level. It just sort of happens by coincidence that a lot of those initiatives are being pushed forward by women. And I think that's a great thing. You know, several people today have noted how amazing it is to look out in this room and to see all these amazing women and to hear about things that people are working on. And you know, in this paper that I'm writing, for me it was a chance to really kind of shine a light on some of the things that my friends and colleagues have been doing a lot of hard work on for the last couple of years to you know, do what they do to try to make a difference. A second objective is to explore the practicality and applications of community-based planning. So community-based planning is an idea, it's a process, it's a tool that comes from urban planning. And again, this is one of those areas where I think it's been interesting to sort of work out on the edge, on the fringes of American Indian Studies, because it's been an interesting place, again, in the context of the class that I've been co-teaching with urban planning. You know, we've been trying to figure out, well, where do these tools and processes and methods intersect in terms of what they can provide that's useful or beneficial for tribal communities. The AIS take on it, American Indian Studies or Native American Studies take on it, is, you know, perhaps it's a great chance to indigenize, some of those tools, indigenize the language, to indigenize the process, to take those things from planning, sort of figure out what will work in terms of our own community development efforts. Do what we can to make it Diné, to make it Hopi, to make it Autumn. You know, how do we put our local stamp on those processes? Again, I think it's, you know, we're very early in this effort. There are not a lot of tribes out there who have planning departments or who have planning resources that are adequate for the community. So you know, it's a really, we're living at a great time where you know, there's a lot of enthusiasm in terms of trying to figure out how to put that Indian stamp on these things. The third thing is to advance the indigenization of planning methods for appropriate community development. What I think is important about that point is really kind of breaking apart the language of development. For a lot of people, economic development is a loaded term. You know, something that we see in a lot of our classes in American Indian Studies is that there's a reservation sometimes for students, especially who are very passionate about decolonization. Sometimes there's resistance to taking an economic development class because people don't like ideas of capitalism. You know, people think, well, development has never fared very well for Native communities because a lot of times it has meant that we are extracting our natural resources. For a lot of people, you know, it means, you know, there were very terrible deals made where for our resources, everything from coal, oil, gas, uranium, and so on. And people saying, you know, I don't want to study development. We've had a very bad experience with that. So what we've been trying to work on is, of course, acknowledging that history, but more importantly, trying to figure out how can we use, again, these indigenized processes and tools of planning to equip and empower our communities so that maybe 25, 50, 75 years moving forward, we have a different story, that, you know, we are managing our resources differently, that we no longer feel strong-armed in terms of making decisions about our land, about our water, and about other resources that are in our community. So, you know, again, working with, I think that language has been an interesting aspect of this work. This diagram reflects some of where we've been working on in terms of, again, to imagine American Indian Studies or Native American Studies on the left in terms of what it is that we are experts in. You know, what kind of knowledge do we bring to the table when we're talking about community or economic development. And on the right is a lot of what urban planning brings to the table with regard to their language, their literature, and their expertise. What has been interesting about developing this coursework is that when we're working in that middle area, the shared area with urban planning and American Indian Studies, you know, honestly, in the very early phases of this, there were a lot of growing pains. We had students in American Indian Studies who were very opposed to planners even wanting to come in and do work in Indian country. However, you know, the reality for a lot of our communities is that the folks who are studying over in this area, in many cases, wind up being the folks we wind up contracting to come out to our reservations to do mapping. They're people we pay a lot of money to come to our communities to do GIS, or to teach our people how to do GIS. You know, a lot of times, folks who are trained on this side are people who work for federal agencies, state agencies, local governments that are non-Indian, states, counties, so on and so forth, and they're speaking in this planning language. And you know, a lot of what we advocate for is to our students, many of whom are in fact Native Americans, saying, well, you know, at the very least, you know, be exposed to this language and the process of planning so that you know it's coming down the pike. If you're in a position, maybe one day you're on tribal council, maybe one day you're in an elected position, or you're a division executive, somebody who's running a tribal business, that at least you are aware of what's happening on this side to, again, better kind of protect and advance whatever your community is interested in terms of community development. So looking at it going the other direction, I think what has been interesting about this, this curriculum work is that a lot of times folks on this side, and you know, honestly, a lot of the urban planning students, at least at ASU, are non-native. A lot of times they're international students. They're overwhelmed to learn about sovereignty. They're overwhelmed to learn about the legal and political framework that we work in when we're talking about reservation land, when we're talking about land use, when we're talking about out at Navajo, things like grazing permits. You know, those things are absolutely overwhelming for people who are coming at it from this perspective. And, you know, honestly, I think sometimes it's a little frustrating, especially when we get into the cultural stuff. Because a lot of our students want to say, wait, slow down this conversation about development, because we want to talk about traditional uses of land. We want to talk about cultural places. We want to talk about the importance of plants and animals and the importance of water. You know, we want to look at these things from a cultural lens. So oftentimes, again, you know, we're coming from two very different perspectives and trying to keep the conversation focused on community development. And sometimes, you know, you can't even to come up with new words to talk about development. Somebody earlier today was talking about resilience. Resiliency planning is a buzzword right now in urban planning, and you know, so is sustainability. As somebody mentioned earlier, sustainability is not new to Indigenous people. Resilience, we certainly have a lot to say about that in our communities, and sometimes it's not the same way that these folks are talking about resiliency. So, again, I think there's real value to getting everybody on that same page in terms of how it is that we're going to talk about some important aspects of improving our communities. Now, comprehensive planning, again, is one of those tools. It's a process that's pretty fundamental to planning that a lot of communities use, be that a city, a town, a tribe. Comprehensive planning is something that, I really like the fact that comprehensive planning really involves all of these areas. And what's different about comprehensive planning is it really forces us to kind of think about community development as something bigger than simply economic development. Because a lot of times when we're talking about economic development, we kind of get focused in this area. Historically, it has meant economic development had a lot to do with the extraction of our natural resources. A lot of times the impetus for economic development is job creation and revenue generation. So when we're looking, again, we're kind of expanding that and saying, well, jobs and revenue and, financial well-being is important for our communities, but so is all this other stuff. That we're really committed to making decisions that have some cultural resonance with our communities. That we're hoping to move forward and learn lessons from things like maybe uranium and coal decisions that perhaps weren't, the best decisions for our people, for our water, for our environment, so on and so forth. And so, this community-owned, community-driven process to comprehensive planning is something that, we're really trying to get our students to think about in terms of how do we touch on all these areas? How do we include public health issues? How do we include educational initiatives? And that, again, the old model being that certainly jobs and revenue are important. It's important to continue to sort of improve infrastructure. We certainly want housing, we want good schools, we want to have parks in our communities, but it's also saying let's deal with some of those other issues in our community as well that contribute to creating a positive environment in our communities, but also creating a physical space that we're proud of and that we want to raise our families in. So the 3 stories that I want to share with you today, and I actually really challenged myself with the 3-story approach to this paper because, well, number one, I'm someone who really appreciates biographies. Ever since I was a kid, I always really enjoyed reading biographies, sort of taking in the life story of people and seeing how experiences, kind of shape who they are and what they do. So this is part of that. However, something I didn't think through at the beginning was that coming here and giving this presentation meant that I then had to tell you their stories. Because number 2, I don't feel like I'm a great storyteller. Some of you may know my colleague, Dr. Myla Vicente Carpio. She spends a lot of time here at UNM. She's funny because she always says that she's living proof that not all Native Americans are good artists. And I've seen her doodles in our faculty meetings, and it's true, she's not a great artist. Well, I'm living proof that not all Native people are good storytellers. So this is a real challenge for me. I'm going to bring you these stories because I think they really underline the importance of what a lot of people might refer to as regular people doing really innovative and important things in our communities. And what I really like about these stories is each of these women are doing things that really help to empower youth. Some of these are instances where they're working very closely with youth who live in our reservation communities. And in the case of Debbie Manuel and her Morning Star group, she's being effective, doing some really neat things for youth in an urban setting, which I think is really important because as the census reminds us, we're becoming more and more urban with each subsequent decade. And you know, where I come from in Phoenix, there are definitely a lot of Native people who consider themselves urban Indians. And I think it creates an interesting situation, especially for youth, because what we see a lot of times is there are young people who are really trying to find themselves in terms of their identity. You know, they're questioning, who am I as an Indigenous person? Who am I as an O'odham person? Who am I as a Diné person? And one thing that I really appreciate about Debbie Manuel's effort is that it's very inclusive. You know, it's addressing the fact that not everybody was raised on a reservation, not everybody is connected to family back home, not everybody comes from a household where the language is spoken on a day-to-day basis, not everybody knows how to introduce themselves in a way that's culturally appropriate, not everybody knows how to pray in their language. And then I think that being welcoming and inclusive to students who are really kind of struggling with that is important because, you know, on the university level, we see a lot of students who are struggling with some of those same identity issues. And it's just sort of a, you know, a reminder of the reality of the changing dynamic of identity in a lot of our communities. And so I think that's, you know, an important contribution there. So all of the stories, again, I think have that very common thread of the fact that they're trying to make some sort of opportunity happen so that youth can find their voice and find their own ways to be empowered as Native American people. So the three stories are Dr. Carletta Chief. Who's heard of Dr. Carletta Chief? Okay. That's great. That's a good percentage in the room here. She has been up to some amazing work lately in terms of working on a Navajo response to the Gold King mine spill, and really kind of applying her genius as a Navajo scientist to you know, find ways to work with the different agencies, the federal government, the lawyers, and other scientists who have been involved in trying to respond to that situation. So I'm going to be talking about her. To the right is Jeannie Benally, who has been an extension specialist for the Navajo area. She was working up at Shiprock, and I just discovered recently that she's retired. Which I'm happy that she's able to move on to the next chapter and do what it is she wants to do with her life. However, I'm also very sad because she has done some really amazing things in terms of creating a whole slew of new programs that benefit Navajo youth in the Shiprock area. So with that, who is aware of extension? Who knows what extension is in reservation communities? What can you tell us about extension?
Well, in my experience with extension, I worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs for a long time, 11 years, so I saw some of that activity. And essentially what it was taking usually physical knowledge, material knowledge, from one place to the other. So that's what occurred. And then, of course, there's been the state extension agencies. We've had played a big role in our community through the year over many kinds of different, many different subjects, primarily agricultural,
Yeah, the emphasis in extension is agriculture. So the extension programs are really situated, they emerged out of a program that came to us from an early 19th century policy that wanted to promote agricultural extension for American Indians. And so at its roots, in its early days, it very much was in line with the federal government's idea that we should all be farmers. So there's sort of that little bit of an old school aspect to it in terms of its origins. However, so the story that I'm going to share today will show you that extension is one of those areas where I think Indian people who have been involved with extension services have really, been able to kind of get in there and indigenize a lot of the programs and services that they do, so that many of those initiatives, are culturally appropriate. So Jeannie Benally has been doing some really amazing work in that area. Debbie Manuel here, I'll talk about her nonprofit, Morning Star Leaders. She created an opportunity for an urban youth council, which at its beginning, she really created it for Navajo youth who happened to be living in urban areas, primarily Phoenix. However, once she sort of launched this nonprofit and started the youth council, she realized that the need was even greater than that of Navajo youth in the Phoenix area, and that what she was trying to do in terms of create a youth council that created somewhat of a safe space for Native youth to come and be indigenous and to talk about leadership and to get mentoring and to really kind of get excited about what it is that they want to do with their futures and how it is that they want to contribute to tribal communities. She realized that the breadth was even greater in terms of the impact that she could have, not just for Navajo youth, but for people from all different communities. This is a photo from yesterday, actually. Tuesday. Debbie Manuel came to my policy class to meet my students and to talk about her upcoming run for a Senate seat in the Arizona State Legislature. So I thought it was such an effective presentation because as part of my federal Indian policy class, I spent some time talking about the state-tribal relationship and some of the opportunities, limitations, some of the history of Indian nations' relationships with states, but how oftentimes local policy decisions can have implications for what's happening in Washington, D.C. So, it's one thing for me to talk to students about the Native vote, to talk about engagement in political process, so on and so forth, but for me to then have Debbie Manuel come to the office and to come to the classroom and to say, I'm running for office, to talk about how she's someone who was kind of fed up and frustrated with what was happening in her community, how she was able to get support from friends and neighbors and other people, and to make this ambitious run for an Arizona State Senate seat was something that had an amazing impact on my students. I think it was a great example of role modeling. She came into the classroom the other day and just was able to inspire so many of the students in that class to register to vote, to learn more about politics and policy on the state level. Some of them were fired up enough after the class to offer Debbie their time and service to volunteer to help her to do a Get Out the Vote campaign and to get out and gather signatures and to get people to show up at the polls for the primary election. So, it's some really amazing stuff that she does, and again, being able to show the students through some of what she's been doing in the community, a great example of leadership I think has been quite significant. So Some of this I've already talked a little bit about, but I think an important message here with this paper that I want to convey is the importance of those community partnerships. And again, I think for the work that I've been doing, that those partnerships are kind of twofold. On the one level, in what I'm doing with my research, with publications, and also with curriculum that is shared with other disciplines across the university, there is a chance to do these collaborative partnerships within the academy. I think they've been incredibly helpful and timely in some cases. There's been a lot of talk about the Navajo Generating Station. And Navajo Nation has approached ASU in trying to figure out how can we work with experts within these academic institutions to figure out what what's next is going to be for the communities impacted by Navajo Generating Station. The communities, Navajo Nation, Hopi, are coming to the university and saying, we want to talk to scientists, we want to hear from engineers, we want to hear from people who are doing sustainability studies, who are experts at environmental work, to figure out, give us information to help us make this important set of decisions. As you all know, the academy these days, there's so many more new degree programs and majors and things that you can study these days that for Navajo Nation, I think it's been a little bit of a quandary, because in ASU being the size that it is, ASU can throw 30, 40 experts at Navajo Nation in terms of trying to figure out the science and the engineering and the environmental. We have people from art and design wanting to, say, here are some options in terms of what to do with the facility after it closes. So what we've tried to do is to say, wait, don't forget American Indian Studies. These are tribal communities who are going to be impacted by the future closure of Navajo Generating Station. And we're the ones, again, kind of thinking back to that Venn diagram, we're the ones who can inform you all about the legal, political context. We're the ones who can tell you about some of the cultural considerations or some of our history with these types of projects in our communities that might explain why we're reluctant to make certain decisions, or why we're not so fast to be on board with some of what these other experts might be telling you in terms of what needs to be done next with a project like Navajo Generating Station. So again, we're talking about that partnership on the academic level, but in the case of Navajo Generating Station, we're seeing that connection to the actual community. It's a chance to cross that bridge and to work closely with the Navajo Nation. And again, Navajo being the size that it is, means that it's probably not just having a conversation with Window Rock, but it means having a conversation with the chapters in the area of Navajo Generation Station that are going to really feel the direct impact of a change in that area, be that economic, environmental, so on and so forth. But it also means having that conversation with people from the Hopi community as well. So the Debbie Manuel story, and I already started to get into this a little bit, but I think probably the initiative that Debbie Manuel started that really started to send a message to our community in the way that we realized this woman is a bundle of energy that's going to do some really amazing things, not just for Navajo people in our community, but she has such a deep commitment to youth, and a lot of that was first demonstrated by her founding of the Morning Star Leaders Youth Council. I remember having coffee with Debbie probably 4 or 5 years ago when she had this idea for the youth council, and she, at the time, was going around and talking to people like Peterson Zaw, talking to Navajo students at Arizona State University, talking to elders back in the Clavico area, where she comes from, and really trying to get a feel for, how do I get community support so that we can build something positive for Navajo youth. She's very, very persistent, very passionate about what she does, and we talked earlier, I think it was Governor Tiller who talked about having that link, being linked to other people who are mentors. I really enjoy the story that Debbie Manuel tells about Annie Wanika being one of her relatives, and that she, as a small child, remembers Annie Wanika sort of scurrying around the community, visiting her family, and just being really involved in a lot of the issues that were important to the people there. And Debbie will say, she didn't realize that that was Annie Wanika, the great Annie Wanika, until she was a little older, and then began to kind of realize the magnitude of what her relative did on behalf of Navajo people. So, when we talk about being connected, not only receiving that hand up or that, support, somebody giving you a shoulder to lean on, giving you words of encouragement, which I think, definitely push Debbie forward. But I think she also extends that to the youth who are part of her youth council. And a really important aspect of this youth council is that most of the young people who are on the council are junior high and high school students, but a lot of the outreach initiatives that they do benefit even younger children. So what we've seen, the youth council's been active now for probably 3, almost 4 years. The youth council themselves are inspiring an even younger group of children in terms of getting them excited about one day being part of the council, but also going out and doing community service projects, just like the Morning Star Youth Council does right now. One of the annual initiatives that Morning Star does is a backpack drive. And it's always really exciting because in the spring and through the summer, the members of the Youth Council will write letters to big corporations like Arizona Public Service, the Arizona Diamondbacks Foundation, so on and so forth. They also reach out to other nonprofits in the Phoenix area. They write letters to tribal governments requesting either funds to support their backpack drive or to actually submit donations of backpacks and school supplies. It's been amazing to see over the years how this initiative has built so much momentum, to the point where this last time they did it, the youth were able to reach, half a dozen different